about in the last class, we did globalization critiques from the left. And they focused on a series of factors like, for example, political inequality, and we covered a series of sort of theoretical lenses by which you can explain that. And I emphasize that left-wing critiques of globalization very rarely kind of carry the theoretical banners. In other words, it's not that if someone comes up and says, I'm a post-colonial critic or I'm a feminist critic, they oftentimes implicitly carry those assumptions while making sets of arguments that are related to that more than anything else. And you see a lot of contemporary critiques of globalization from the left. Today what we're going to do is critiques of globalization from the right. And this is a kind of smaller body of literature. It's far more common to find left-wing critics of globalization than right-wing critics of globalization, but they do exist. Both of the readings that you had for today were prominent British conservative critiques of globalization. There's some overlap between them, but there's some different arguments that come out as a result of them. Many right-wing critics of globalization point to the exact same problems: hyper-capitalism, a sense of rootlessness, a sense of inequality, but they come to them with different sets of assumptions and different sets of arguments, right? And so what we're going to really look at today is what I would call sort of Tory critiques of globalization. Well, if you were a conservative, why might you find globalization objectionable? In theory, if you're a conservative, you support capitalism, you should support economic growth as a result of capitalism, so why might you find it somewhat objectionable? So the two people, just a little bit about the two that you were reading today. Roger Scruton's a British political theorist. He's an interesting guy. He just wrote a very nice critique of left-wing thought, Fools and Firebrands, which I was reading the other day. And John Gray's False Dawn, which is probably the most famous left-wing critique of globalization. Both of them are critiqued because essentially they're not economic arguments, they're political cultural arguments. So these are not really, strictly speaking, these are not economists. These are not people who make economic arguments, but people who make cultural arguments, and they make quite sweeping cultural arguments. Scruton's has got some problems, it's a little bit dated, but we'll talk about this in a second. Scruton lays out a fairly basic hypothesis, and you see this through Benjamin Barber, who was an American political theorist in the 1990s, as well as Scruton. This book was published in 2002, so it's a little bit dated. It's written right after September 11th, so if you guys read this, you probably thought, wait a minute, there's a little bit of this that's dated here. That's why, because it was written right after 2002. What he argues is that when we think about this, and the key idea to get from Scruton is this sense of, what does it mean to be connected to a state? What does it mean for us to say that we're connected to the United States? Now, from a strict social contract vantage point, when we think about the Lockean tradition, what does that mean? What does citizenship mean from a Lockean tradition? Come on, what does it mean from a Lockean tradition? Andrew, what does it mean?
That you get certain rights and some sort of protection from sovereign.
Yeah, so a contractual relationship with the state assumes that I get rights and that I have a relationship with the sovereign. I pay taxes, the sovereign protects me, the sovereign protects my property. That is a kind of strict contractual view. Why do we call it a social contract theory? Because what have I done? I've struck a contract with the state. I pay the state loyalty, I give it my military service, I pay taxes, and in practice the state protects me in a lot of different sets of ways. Scruton, and I would also argue probably Gray and others, critique this notion of citizenship on one basic ground. They argue that it's too cold, it's too transactional. That in fact actually citizenship means something just different than a question of rights and responsibilities. It's not just a thin social contract. But citizenship means something different than that. It's not just that I strike a deal with the United States government that protects my private property, but if that were the Iraqi government, the Somali government, the Canadian government, it wouldn't in fact actually matter. They argue that you should think of citizenship as an organic conception. What does that mean? Citizens are not just people in mutually contractual relationships with the states. Citizens are also people who are in a family with one another. Right? So let's assume when we think about the United States, do we think of this just in terms of rights and responsibilities? No, the argument would be, we think of this in terms of my fellow citizens as a family, and I'm connected organically to the state, and I'm connected organically to the land. How this is often described is that you don't think of the citizenship as essentially just a kind of deal that you strike, but you think of it in terms of home and hearth. In other words, that this is the place that I make my home, I have an organic connection to the land, I have an organic connection to the society, and I'm supported by traditional social mores, cultural institutions, economic way of life. For both Scruton and Gray, the way you should really think about them is people who romanticize small town life, the kind of rhythms of a small town, the rhythms of a small village, that it's not just a case that this social institution or this sort of factory exists, but that factory supports an economic life, a social life, a cultural life in a small town. And so conservative critiques of globalization often start from that assumption. They say, look, a lot of you are Lockeans, you just think this is a bargain about your private property and your rights, but there's something else with citizenship. That other thing with citizenship is a sense of connection to territory and a sense of what it does to economic and social institutions. That the fact that the factories exist in the way they do and the local businesses exist what they do supports a social infrastructure, a cultural infrastructure, and that's how we all find ourselves with meaning. To some extent, this has some sympathies with communitarianism. Communitarianism argues that I find my meaning, my personal meaning through community. And you can see conservative critiques of this have a little bit of an overlap, although most communitarians would argue, in fact, actually, that they're from the left, but you can see more or less the same argument. And you get this sense of kind of this notion of citizenship as being something different than contracts with people like David Hume and others. What's the problem then with globalization? Following Scruton's first arguments, Scruton says one of the problems with globalization is it delocates your notion of citizenship. What does that mean? What does Scruton mean by that? It delocates your notion of citizenship.
So instead of maybe having an obligation to your land and the people that are being close to you, you have an obligation to people who are in other nations and other countries by like buying goods from other places.
Yeah. So if you go back and think about traditional economic life in the 1800s. You were located in an infrastructure that was probably not economically efficient, but you had social and economic connections and cultural relationships with people in your immediate village. What happens through globalization? Many of those factories, many of those businesses, many of those companies go out of business. You wind up finding yourself in a position where you're delocated from your immediate environment, and your dependence is upon people in international capital markets. Your dependence is upon people who are producing your goods. So to put this in kind of sharp, practical terms, you are no longer buying your vegetables and fruit from the local farms. You are buying your vegetables and fruit from Argentina and from Mexico and from other places around the world, and the result has been a severing of your connection to the local place. And as a result, he argues, this in fact actually changes a lot, pushes a lot of things, and it is a real challenge to citizenship, right? It really sort of pushes citizenship in different kinds of ways. He argues that what this has produced is this produces a sense of rootlessness. When globalization winds up destroying many existing social and economic structures, it produces a sense of rootlessness. That I am no longer connected to my local community, and therefore I find meaning elsewhere. And in this respect, he draws distinctions between what he says has happened in the Western world and what has happened in part of the Islamic world. Now, I want to argue one thing about Scruton. I like Scruton's stuff, but it's a vast simplification of the Islamic world. I'm going to just put a pin in this. A lot of what he wrote in this piece is, I think, a simplification, but let's just at least extend the argument because it's a common argument. You often see this made even among the left. The argument he makes is, think about what happens in Western states. In Western states, you're in a position under which you are now increasingly delocated from your cultural environment. You're de-skilled. There's a sense of meaninglessness. You're not as connected to your local community. Now think about what happens in the Muslim world. How would we explain the revolt against globalization? What does he argue?
Because of religion?
Because of religion in a sense, yeah, and he makes a contrast on citizenship. What does he say on citizenship from this?
It's the exact opposite of that organic relationship we have here. They're not really a part of the land, I guess. They're just kind of, they're just loyal because they have to.
So he makes a couple arguments here. One thing he says is the Western notion of citizenship is a organic notion of citizenship where you're connected to the land, you're connected to the country, and therefore national identification matters more than anything else. He argues that if you were to take Islamism, and what's the difference between Islamism and Islam? Anybody know? Draw that distinction? Islam is a religion. Islamism is Islam as a political ideology. When you organize the state on the basis of the religious principles or a version of the religious principles, it's called Islamism. So he spends a lot of time here critiquing Islamism, which is a political ideology. The Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamist organization. That's different than saying Islam, right? Very, very different. And this is where, again, I want to emphasize there are some vast simplifications that are part of this. One of the things that he argues is that when you take a look at groups that are groups like Al-Qaeda that have a sense of rebellion against the West, what are they in fact rebelling against? They're rebelling against the sense of rootlessness in their own societies. That many of the states that are created in the Middle East, because of the degree of corruption, nepotism, and clientelistic relationships, you never develop that organic connection with the state. That organic connection with the state is essentially severed. Why? Because what you wind up with in many cases is one-party state with dictatorships. That's what you wind up with. He calls it, he has a nice phrase for it. Anybody remember what he calls it? What does he call it? The personal state. Come on, you guys got to read this stuff. He calls it the personal state. Don't leave me being the only person doing the reading. I'm as distracted by the news as you guys are. The personal state, what does he mean by that? He means that Western states have a sense of corporate personality. I'm connected to the United States. I believe the United States acts through corporate personality. I have an organic connection to the state. When you think of a state like Egypt, when you think of a state like Syria, what do you actually wind up having? A state in the hands of its ruler. You can't understand the Syrian state without understanding Assad. You can't understand the Egyptian state without understanding Sisi. You have to understand that many of these states, when you think about what is the state is a vehicle for personal enrichment of the ruler rather than for the benefit of the citizens. So when you go back and contrast these two types of citizenship, what in fact actually do you have? Western organic conception of the citizenship being challenged by globalization, and you have a transnational ideology of Islamism that emerges because in many cases these states have failed. And so what happens through globalization? Globalization allows people who were objecting to the political conditions they find in the Muslim world to band together and strike back against the West. And why do they do that? Because in many cases, the West is responsible for the creation of these states. If you go back and think about how these states were created in Egypt and Libya and other places, they were most of the time colonial constructs. And so the argument is that you wind up seeing Al-Qaeda as an organization as being a reaction to globalization. That's what Scruton argues. That is essentially an attempt for what he calls the Muslim middle class, part of the Muslim middle class, and again, this is tiny, tiny numbers, of people who are very conversant with globalization, who see that what has happened through globalization. Their societies were carved up through imperialism. They were then subjected to impersonal economic forces through globalization, and they're reacting to a West that is continuing doing domination. In which respect, what do you then understand? Globalization as a process has facilitated a kind of cultural clash. A cultural clash between Western states, empowered to some degree by globalization, although delocalized in other excessive ways, but it has exacerbated cultural differences with the Muslim world. And that's one of the reasons that you continually see that revolt against globalization. That you should understand Al-Qaeda and ISIS as not just specifically seeking foreign policy goals, but to some extent as a byproduct of globalization going wrong. They're a revolt of a community and a society that has been attacked through globalization, essentially pushing back against the state. What do you guys think? Do you guys buy that as an argument? There's been a lot of versions of this to say that you can't understand transnational terrorism, you can't understand transnational movements that are essentially attempting to tear down the Western order unless you think of this as a reaction to globalization in and of itself. You guys find that persuasive or not?
I kind of agree with it, like that concept where like we have had a heavy hand in the construction of essentially terrorism, the Western world itself, because like if you look back in history, in the course of history, it's a result of colonial globalization and our market and things like that that have led to the political dismay over there, and it's eventually starting to help us again.
Yeah, I mean, if you take his argument seriously, and I do think there are some flaws in his argument, I think he oversimplifies by Islam, right? We all know that there's Sunni, there's Shia, there's Salafi, there's Hulser, there's Sufi. There's a lot of varieties of Islam, and it's a vast simplification of it. But let's just take his argument as it stands. What he argues is, look at what's happened to these states. Imperialism carves out these states. You draw borders. You wind up with architectural structures like the sort of modernist movements that went into a lot of these societies that decimate local structures. You delocalize those people, and then you give them tools through globalization where they can attack back against the West. And so you can't understand what's happening with globalization unless you understand that what it has been a relentless assault on hearth and home. That had we allowed these states to develop an organic conception of the state, you might not have had that degree of terrorism.
I agree with the argument in a way, but I feel like with a lot of people, they feel not inclined to agree because they feel like you're sympathizing with like negative things, you know?
You're sympathizing with whom?
With like maybe like terrorism or something like that. You feel like that if you give them sympathy, then it's like you're against our state, you know?
Well, yeah, and so one of the arguments here is you could make that argument. To some extent, I would always argue there's a difference between understanding and unjustifying, or explaining and justifying. So you can think about this logically, right? I can understand Al-Qaeda. That doesn't mean I justify it. I can understand imperialism. Doesn't mean I justify it. Part of the argument here, and Al-Qaeda always makes this argument, the United States likes to portray Al-Qaeda as a pre-modern movement. They say, this is essentially a bunch of savages in caves. Not true. These are people using encryption on phones. These are people with clear political ideologies. These are people with a clear sense of direction. And part of their argument is to say globalization has empowered them. That they might have been in a disaffected position 30 to 40, 50 years ago. With modern communications, modern travel, they can now find ways to strike back at the heart of a society or the heart of a process that's effectively delocalizing their territories. And it's not an accident, if you take Scruton's argument seriously. Where did they hit on September 11th? World Trade Center. Can you come up with a better example of globalization than that? I mean, in all seriousness. And so you could make an argument that there is to some extent, you can look at this as either a backlash against westernization, globalization, and there's a distinction to be drawn there. Scruton argues that westernization and globalization more or less go hand in hand. Other people argue globalization is not exclusively a Western process. So it's not going to lead to Americanization, right? Other people argue that it in fact actually will. I'm more inclined to think that there's a degree of culturalism associated with it. Anybody else? What do you guys think? Persuasive or not? Nobody wants to jump in because none of you were reading this last night because you were all paying attention to Twitter. Okay. When you think about this argument, I mean, part of what he's doing here is he's essentially making an argument that that's how you understand globalization, and that's how you understand the threats that come from globalization. The problem here is that essentially, if you look at this, we're looking at a world under which globalization is threatening a sense of locality in two ways. In the Middle East, it's threatening a sense of locality by essentially pressuring these states, by severing the organic connection with the state, by forcing them to be subject to global economic processes. And he's right on this argument. If you were to think about much of the developing world, they don't have an opportunity to develop local infrastructure and local economies that are separated from the global market. There are very few local economies separated from the global market. And one of the arguments he makes in this is what you often see as a result of this. The use of multinationals rather than the use of local products. So if you were to go, for example, to the Muslim world, you go back, for example, to a country like Egypt, if you were to go to a country like Jordan, you will find Coca-Cola banners when you're there. They're not going to build local sort of Coca-Cola or entertainment areas in the same way. They're going to use Western multinationals. And that's in part because you don't have the opportunity to build a separate market that's distinct from what you see as part of the global market more than anything else. The problem is that globalization is also threatening the West in a different way by delocalizing the notion of citizenship. So you are simultaneously turning to the developing world, turning to the Muslim world, and saying, you will adopt the mandates of global capitalism, even if that delocalizes your economy, even if that disrupts your local economy, even if that shatters existing social structures. Equally, you will turn to the United States and say, you are losing control of your sovereignty, you are losing control of your local markets. You are delocalized because you no longer can rely on other people in your local environment from your market. In that sense, how do we understand globalization, you would argue? Globalization is a threat from the bottom and from the top. It's a threat from the top to the existence of a lot of these states. It's a threat from the bottom to the populations and to your sense of citizenship and your sense of self. So you can't think of globalization merely as an enterprise that essentially threatens other states. You have to think of it as one under which it essentially will provide threats from both sides. Okay, questions about that? The basic argument here is about threats to the bottom, threats to the top, delocalization, and how the delocalization, particularly applied to the Muslim world, produces a kind of global backlash, which you can understand as the Islamist movement against the state. Now, interestingly enough, one of the ways this was critiqued is that the argument is that Islamist movements want to create a sense of an ummah, right, of a collective community of Muslims. The argument is that, in fact, actually, if you read Al-Qaeda's response to this, and they didn't exactly respond to Scruton, but they have responded to these arguments. And what they actually say is, that's not true, we want our own state. Right? This notion that we want this sort of grand transnational community is at least partially true. In the long run, we eventually want our own state. It's also a long-run historical process. Right? So there's a degree to which I think this is kind of simplification. Okay, last 15 minutes, we're going to do Gray's False Dawn. What does Gray's False Dawn argue? He makes kind of a very similar argument on this. What he argues is that globalization is producing as an engine of inequality. That we like to think of globalization as producing kind of equality for all, integration of people into global markets, but in fact, actually, globalization doesn't do that. Globalization actually does it in unequal proportions. So the first thing you have to understand is globalization is not integrating all markets. Think about a country like North Korea. They're essentially outside the globalized market. Somalia is essentially largely outside the globalized market. The globalized market has a kind of irregular degree of sort of collection, and it's not relieving national equality.
But is it inherently, like, in the definition of globalization that people are going to be left out, or is that their choice to be left out of globalization?
So the question is globalization a process you can opt in or opt out of? Gray would argue you can't opt out of it. And Gray in the piece basically says it's impossible to opt out of it. That what you wind up seeing is states would like to opt out of it. They would like to ring-fence local markets. And we're all familiar with this, right? States would like to ring-fence local markets. They'd like to make sure that, for example, the American cotton manufacturing market is not globalized. In fact, in practice, they actually can't do so, but they're drawn in on unequal terms. Some states are able to embrace fully globalization. If you, for example, look at a society like Singapore that has managed to have a higher per capita income than the United States at this point through integration through the financial markets, that's an example of a state that embraced globalization. Other states get drawn into globalization. But he argues that the global utopians make an argument that over time, we're all going to be equally integrated into the market. He says, no, there's going to be partial integration into the market. And as a result, there will be partial gains. States like Singapore, maybe the United States, will benefit a lot from globalization. Others will, in fact, actually not. Others will benefit in ways that are sort of much more varied than this. So you can't assume in the long run that this is based on globalization. Like Scruton, he argues globalization is producing kind of vast but unacknowledged social effects. It's actually what it winds up doing is disrupting traditional economies and disrupting traditional notions of citizenship more than anything else. And he points out that this is very different than the pre-1914 globalization. And this is one of his particular intellectual arguments. So people who defend globalization argue that if you were to go back and look at the volume of international trade, it was as high before 1914 as it is today. So that what we're seeing today is more or less a repeat of the pre-1914, pre-World War I global integration. Bray argues, no, that's not in fact actually the case, because much of that was done on a national basis. What globalization does is it takes commerce and it forces it onto an international basis. Again, you may have in the past been able to ring-fence your commerce in a national way to deal with local markets. You can no longer do so. It forces you into an international market, and that leaves the state significantly less powerful. What in fact actually it does is it says that when you think about what globalization does, is it essentially disrupts local markets in favor of multinationals. And Gray is particularly concerned by the influence of multinational corporations. Multinational corporations, in his view, are different than the multinational corporations that we might have seen in previous generations. Multinational corporations in these generations are not like the East India Trading Company that are nationally based and tied into a clear sense of imperialism. They are partially and half located in societies and half located outside of it. And you can see this today when you think about multinational corporations, right? They are partially located in a national context, but they are not in the service of the national context. McDonald's doesn't work to American national interests. It's located in 100 different countries. It may be an American company with American cultural practices, but it doesn't essentially work on behalf of the United States in the same way the East India Company acted on behalf of Britain during globalization. It doesn't exactly work in the same way. So you get these multinational corporations that are themselves kind of rootless. For the most part, societies experience globalization not as an opportunity for disruption. That instead of being able to maintain the local economy, you are subject to market fluctuations. The market can effectively move. Multinational corporations destroy local economies, and you wind up in an environment under which you have a disrupted economy and a disrupted social and traditional structure more than anything else. One of the things that he argues in this is that the result of this is de-skilling. What does he mean by that?
He argued that it caused like a decrease in the labor force, and that the amount of people who were doing having like a main force, people were just being contracted to companies versus they're building a high class of labor.
Yeah, he makes a couple arguments. Exactly. A couple of the things you're drawing out here. One thing he argues is when you think about de-skilling labor, what he means by this is a smaller and smaller number of people are benefiting from globalization. If you were to go back to the markets of the 1950s and 1960s, if any of you take the regional rail down through North Philadelphia, and you see the old shuttered factories, what he would argue is if you were to go back to those periods of time, people had manufacturing skilled labor jobs. In practice, what happens with globalization is it destroys those local markets, it leaves you subject on foreign imports and foreign fluctuations, and then it de-skills the local population. Profits go to the people at the top, but the people who are working in those jobs actually find themselves getting less skilled labor. So to put this in sharp terms, it might have been if you didn't have a college education and you worked in the factory in 1900. Today, where would you be? You'd be working in a less skill-intensive job, right? You might be working in a less skill-intensive service-oriented job. This is de-skilling the population. Whereas before you had cultures that produced artisans, they produced people with technical expertise. Today, you're de-skilling the workforce and putting people in sort of socially and politically transient jobs, right? So how do I put this in direct terms for you guys? What does he really mean by that? So describe the kind of what does he actually mean? Well, he means that you might have been a factory worker and now you're working at the mall in a part-time, short-term contract. Right? What does that mean? That has de-skilled your labor. As a result of it having to do de-skilling your labor, because those factories are no longer needed, large portions of the society have been de-skilled and pushed down into very, very, very unstable forms of work. And if you're pushed into very unstable forms of work where unemployment is regular, if you're working in the Walmart rather than working in the factory, then what is the consequence of that? What happens to the social and political structure that you're in?
Well, I would say the workforce as a whole is unhappy, and there's not going to be like money and capital available.
Workforce is unhappy, not money and capital available. Go back, remember his concern. His concern is traditional social economic structure. Do you build that in those sort of positions? Probably not, right? So this is the argument. His argument is I've de-skilled your labor. I've left you subject, vulnerable to the whims of the market forces. So you've got this kind of hyper-globalism, which means now most of your goods are imported. Your labor has been de-skilled. You've been put into a transient job. It's harder for you to build stable social and cultural relationships and traditional relationships that give your life meaning. And so what globalization has done has not been to, for example, lift your boats. You might be able to buy the radio cheaper, but you no longer are caught in a web of social and cultural relationships that gives you meaning because your labor's been effectively de-skilled. That's one of the arguments that it makes. And there is something to this. If you were to go back and think about what has been the revolt that produced Trump, it has been people who largely, not in every case, but a lot of people in sort of the old coal towns or in a lot of manufacturing towns that have dried up in Iowa and Ohio, now finding that their labor has been de-skilled. As a result of their labor has been de-skilled, the returns they're getting is lower, and their sense of connection to their community is lower, so what do we see as a byproduct of that? Drug abuse, right? That's what you wind up seeing. Gray's not making an argument that's entirely crazy here. There is something to this. There is something to the notion that you wind up de-skilling this more than anything else. This is also the case where the multinationals themselves don't have ties to the community and don't have reasons to give back. So if the more we produce a society where your labor has been de-skilled and you're getting most of your goods from multinational corporations are not connected to the national context. In other words, what do they owe a society like the United States? Very little. And we can see this very clearly in taxation. What do a lot of multinational corporations try to do? Offshore their taxes. By offshoring your taxes, you make sure that you don't pay back to the society itself. Now, there are clear examples of multinational corporations that have started to show social responsibility. Starbucks, I don't know if you saw this the other day, said they're going to hire 10,000 refugees. There are companies that start to do this, but one result of capitalism, of globalization, is I've allowed multinational corporations the ability to be more or less means of exchange in society. They simply count money, and they privatize much of their labor force. And by privatizing much of their labor force, they de-skill it, and they leave it vulnerable. And so as a result, what you're seeing is globalization is producing a kind of hyper-capitalism. That hyper-capitalism leaves us all subject to market fluctuations. It disrupts traditional political and social economies, and it leaves us in a position under which it's extraordinarily difficult for us to be able to sort of function. He also argues one of the big problems here is that the bigger the multinational corporations get, the less responsible these multinational corporations are, the more they dwarf the sovereign state. And he draws a contrast between pre-1914 integration and present integration today. Pre-1940 integration, much of the multinational corporations acted on behalf of the state. They saw themselves as agents of the state, tied to the state, responsible to the state. Right? Dutch trading companies, English trading companies, and so on. Conventional multinationals today are more or less international organizations. They do not function with any traditional loyalty to the state. They offshore their taxes, and as a result of that, they dwarf the power of the sovereign state. This means that sovereign states find themselves in a position where they can get bullied by multinational corporations. Now, why that's so important is go back to the traditional notion of what we get from realism. Realism tells us what's the central unit of the system? Come on. Realism tells us the central unit of the system is? States. What is Gray making the argument? The bigger and bigger your multinational corporation gets, the more likely your multinational corporation dwarfs the power of the state.
So is this like how the East India Trading Company like essentially was able to take over India because of the results of like buying up areas and eventually like having power like with the Bali of Bengal and like being able to eventually take over the area? Is it kind of like the same concept?
So the East India Trading Company, what he's drawing is a slightly different concept. He says the East India Trading Company was able to seize large parts of India through negotiations with local leaders and trade deals with local leaders, but it was implicitly supported by the British state. The British state kept greenlighting the East India Trading Company and taking it, and would back up the East India Trading Company. So the old line about the British Empire, which he quotes in there from Sir John Seeley, which is the British got an empire by a fit of absence of mind. The argument is that companies like the East India Trading Company kept moving into India, getting economic interests, getting in trouble locally, and then calling in the British state to wind up seizing control of it. This is how the argument is that the British walked into an empire and suddenly woke up one morning where a degree of economic trade went through that essentially they produced the East India Trading Company led to the empire. I'm not exactly sure that's fair, but at the minimum, what you have there is this argument that the East India Trading Company was acting on behalf of the state. It was an agent of the state, and it was tied to the priorities of the state. Gray's argument is, what is capitalism producing? Who does McDonald's work for? Not for the United States government. Who does Starbucks, Ford, all of the large companies, Apple, work for? They offshore their taxes, they offshore their production, Apple's iPhones are being built in China. They're not being built here. As a result, no labor here. That de-skills your labor. People who otherwise would have bought the phone are now wind up working service jobs. And they're not in any way in a position where they work on behalf of the national government. In fact, actually, they dwarf the national government. And in cases like that, multinational corporations are able to dictate terms to national governments. I'll give you the nicest example of this I know. ExxonMobil does this. ExxonMobil, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, has assets bigger than the countries that it's dealing with. So what ExxonMobil does is it sets up private security forces for its own oil platforms in sub-Saharan Africa. And you have a case under which the CEO of ExxonMobil might be more powerful than the head of state that they're talking to on the basis of things like sort of raw assets, even in some cases with security protection. If this is the case, then what's happening with globalization? He calls it a kind of disordered and anarchic form of capitalism. That we ourselves are tying ourselves to a market that fluctuates. That market moves constantly. We are subject to the whims of that market. We are ourselves being delocalized. We are being de-skilled. We are losing connections with our local market. I no longer buy groceries from the guy down the street. I buy them from Argentina when I go to the store. Right? And multinational corporations are getting more and more powerful than the sovereign state. And as a result of doing so, they are less connected to state priorities. Sovereign states find themselves sort of pushed out of the way by these markets more than anything else. And so as a result of this, when we think of this form of disordered capitalism, what is this happening? Well, his argument is this is actually ending the middle class. Globalization is producing a process that is de-skilling a lot of labor and ending the middle class. He has a nice phrase in this. He calls it euthanasia for the bourgeoisie. Why? Because what's happening is traditionally the long term, we had the middle class as the most powerful driver of the society. That's not what globalization is producing these days. Globalization is producing these days turning us back into a proletariat. And if any of you guys look at American economic trends, you can see this really clearly. More and more people are shifting out of the middle class and into the lower class, working class, lower middle class than going up. And this is exactly what he's talking about, because the job at the factory, the job in the market, the job that would have required skilled labor is disappearing, and increasingly you're being left with jobs that are de-skilled, paying a lower return. And the result is that you're getting higher and higher processes of globalization. So what we're actually in fact seeing here is a process under which globalization is going to lead us to be significantly poorer. And it's going to lead us to be significantly poorer in part because it destroys local communities. What you can see with both Scruton and Gray is they make arguments about the connection between you and the state. That you are deeply connected to your state. When that doesn't happen, when you don't have a deep connection to your state, you see other forms of political community. You see other forms of political association. Islamism is one argument in the Muslim world, but in these states, globalization is a process which is leading to the destruction of the state and leading to the destruction of the communities. And more to the point, it's leading to the destruction of the communities where governments are unable to find ways to stop it from happening. Right? And so that fundamentally is a conservative critique. Ultimately, the same inequality matters here, but it's not just a question of relative gains, it's a question of whether you're connected to the state and whether you get that sense of hearth and home from the state itself. And the more globalization delocalizes that, the poorer you are, even if in fact you can buy that radio for a cheap price. Okay, that's it. Thank you, guys. Everybody got a copy of tape assignment and it's up on Canvas? It's due February 21st, so you got a month. A little less than that.